My daughter told me to miss my brother's funeral because she had brunch reservations. "Dad, funerals are for the dead," Natalie had said to me over the phone. "My kids are alive. Priorities." She said that about Samuel, my older brother, the man who kicked down a burning door 40 years ago and dragged me out by the collar of my shirt. The man whose burned silver pocket watch was sitting in the palm of my hand when she hung up on me. I was 68 years old, a widower of 5 years, and for the last 3 years, my Sundays had belonged to Natalie. Not because I offered, because she had decided retirement meant I had nothing valuable left to do with my time. Somewhere along the line, Natalie had stopped seeing me as her father and had started seeing me as a free, mandatory on-call childcare service. She rarely asked, she informed. It started with small favors. A quick hour while Natalie got her nails done. A Saturday morning while David had a meeting. Then the favors became expectations. Then the expectations became orders. I missed doctor's appointments, cancelled lunches with friends, and once skipped the memorial breakfast for an old coworker because Natalie had decided a last-minute spa day was good for her mental health. Every time I hesitated, she would sigh and say, "Dad, don't you want to spend time with your grandchildren? You're retired." This is literally what grandparents are for. As if loving Leo and Maya meant surrendering every hour of my life without notice. That Sunday morning, I put on the heavy black suit I had worn to my wife's funeral. I pinned a small white carnation to my lapel. I poured a cup of black coffee, stood in my kitchen, and waited for my daughter to prove she had not meant what she said. At exactly 9:30, her silver SUV pulled abruptly into my driveway. Natalie was 38 years old, married to a corporate consultant named David, and a mother to 2 beautiful, energetic children, 7-year-old Leo and 5-year-old Maya. I loved my grandchildren more than words could adequately express. They were the absolute light of my twilight years. The front doors opened, and Natalie and David stepped out. David was wearing a sharp, tailored gray suit, looking exactly like the corporate consultant he was. Natalie was wearing an expensive silk dress, her hair perfectly blown out, carrying a massive canvas tote bag over her shoulder. They opened the back doors and pulled Leo and Maya out into the drizzle. I stood by the kitchen island as they barged through the front door. The house was instantly filled with the chaotic noise of children. "Hey, Grandpa!" Leo shouted, running past me into the living room to find the television remote. Maya clung to Natalie's leg, rubbing the sleep out of her eyes. Natalie didn't even look at me. She marched straight to the kitchen table and dropped the heavy canvas bag onto the wood with a loud thud. "Okay, the kid's bag is in the front pocket," Natalie said rapidly, speaking to me as if I were a hired teenager who charged by the hour. Maya's quiet time schedule is taped to the outside of the lunchbox. Leo is not allowed to have screen time until after lunch, and make sure he finishes his math worksheet before you let him play in the yard. She finally looked up from the bag. Her eyes swept over my black suit, the white carnation, and the polished black dress shoes. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a tiny, suppressed glimmer of guilt. But she immediately buried it under a layer of frantic entitlement. "I see you dressed up," Natalie said dismissively, waving her hand in the air. "I'm sorry you have to miss it, Dad, I really am. But David has an investor brunch at the country club. If we miss it, it affects his partnership track. You know how important this weekend is for David." David walked into the kitchen, checking his expensive wristwatch. He looked at my black suit, giving a thin, tight smile. "We need to go, Nat." "Traffic on the interstate is already backing up," David said. He turned his attention to me. "Thanks for doing this, Robert. We built the weekend around your availability. I'm sure Samuel would understand. Family logistics don't stop because of funerals." I looked at him for a long moment. He said the word logistics the way other men said love. "Your dad always says yes, doesn't he?" David added over his shoulder to Natalie. "Just drop them off. He can handle it." David didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked back out the front door. Natalie leaned down and kissed the top of Maya's head. "Be good for Grandpa, okay? Mommy will be back tomorrow afternoon." She stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked to the door. She didn't hug me. She didn't say goodbye. She just walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. The house fell quiet, save for the distant sound of cartoons playing in the living room. I stood perfectly still by the kitchen island. I looked down at the table. Natalie had left a detailed, color-coded schedule of exactly how I was supposed to spend my Sunday managing her children's lives. She had thrown it down with the absolute certainty that I would follow it, because I had always followed it. I had always bent backward to accommodate her, terrified of losing access to my grandchildren if I ever set a boundary. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the pocket watch. The silver face ticked quietly in my palm. The back was rough, scarred by a fire that had happened 40 years ago. A fire that would have killed me if Samuel hadn't kicked down a burning door and dragged me out by the collar of my shirt. "Dad, funerals are for the dead. My kids are alive. Priorities." I closed my fingers around the watch. The metal was cold, but the memory it held was searing hot. My daughter had just ordered me to miss the funeral of the man who saved my life. And in my pocket, Samuel's burned watch ticked like it still knew the difference between duty and love. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, leaving me standing in the silence of my own home. In the living room, a cartoon played loudly on the television, casting a bright, flickering light across the carpet. Leo was already sprawled out on his stomach, completely absorbed in the screen, while Maya sat cross-legged beside him, meticulously peeling the wrapper off a juice box. They were beautiful, innocent children. They had absolutely no idea that their mother had just used them as collateral in a war she didn't even realize she was fighting. I looked down at the kitchen table. Natalie's canvas tote bag sat there like a heavy anchor. Next to it was the color-coded schedule she had slammed onto the wood. It was printed on thick cardstock, detailing every single hour of the day. 10 a.m. snack time, organic fruit only. 11 a.m. educational workbook, math pages. 12 p.m. lunch, no gluten, no dairy. *1. 30 p.m. Maya nap time. Utori. Umayan at 11 a.m. While Leo was supposed to be doing his math workbook, a priest at a small chapel across town was going to stand up and read the eulogy for my older brother. I looked down at my right hand. I was still clutching Samuel's burned silver pocket watch. My knuckles were white from the grip. I walked over to the kitchen island, pulled out a stool, and sat down. The house was warm, but a deep, pervasive chill had settled into my bones. I opened my hand and stared at the cracked glass face of the watch. 40 years ago, that glass hadn't been cracked. It had been pristine, polished silver, resting in the pocket of Samuel's jacket on a freezing Tuesday night in November. I was 28 years old, living in a cheap, poorly wired duplex on the east side of the city. The fire started in the walls around 2 in the morning. By the time the smoke alarms finally shrieked, the hallway was a solid wall of thick, black smoke, and the ceiling was already collapsing. I had tried to run for the door, but a burning ceiling joist had crashed down, pinning my left leg to the floor. The heat was unimaginable. It wasn't just hot. It was a physical weight pressing the oxygen out of my lungs. I remember the exact moment I stopped fighting. I remember lying on the scorching floorboards, watching the flames curl around the drywall, accepting that I was going to die in that narrow hallway. Then, the front door exploded inward. Samuel didn't wait for the fire department. He lived 3 blocks away, had seen the smoke, and ran straight into the inferno. He didn't wear protective gear. He didn't have oxygen. He just had the desperate, terrifying strength of an older brother who refused to let me die. I remember the sound of him screaming my name. I remember the sickening smell of his own jacket catching fire as he grabbed the burning beam off my leg and threw it aside. He dragged me out by the collar of my shirt. pulling me across the blazing threshold just seconds before the entire roof collapsed into the living room. I walked away with smoke inhalation and a broken leg. Samuel spent 6 months in the severe burn unit at the county hospital. The fire had melted the skin on his right arm, his shoulder, and a large portion of his back. Before the fire, Samuel had been an amateur pilot, training for his commercial license. The nerve damage in his right arm ended that dream permanently. He lost his career, his mobility, and spent years in agonizing physical therapy just to be able to hold a pen again. He eventually became an accountant, spending his life behind a desk instead of in the sky, and in 40 years, he never once complained about it. He never once looked at me with regret, and he never, ever threw it in my face. When people asked him about the terrible, jagged scars that climbed up his neck, Samuel would just smile a quiet, easy smile and say it was a small price to pay for keeping his family intact. Samuel carried the scars on his skin. I carried the life he had pulled out of the fire. The ticking of the burned pocket watch grounded me back in the present. I looked up from the watch and stared at the color-coded schedule on the table. My daughter's handwriting was neat, aggressive, and perfectly organized. Natalie didn't know the full story of the fire. She knew Samuel had helped me, but I had shielded her from the brutal, ugly details of his sacrifice, just like I had shielded her from the truth of how her own life had been funded. 5 years ago, when my wife was diagnosed with terminal cancer, the medical bills had been catastrophic. I had drained our savings, taken out a second mortgage, and was quietly preparing to declare bankruptcy while trying to hold my family together. Then, one afternoon, I received a letter from the hospital's billing department. The remaining balance of $60,000 had been paid in full. I found out later that Samuel had quietly liquidated a massive portion of his own retirement fund to pay it. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell my wife. He just did it. And that wasn't the first time. When Natalie was accepted into a private university and I couldn't afford the tuition gap, a merit scholarship miraculously appeared from a private donor. When Natalie and David wanted to buy their expensive 4-bedroom house in the suburbs and were short on the down payment, a private trust inexplicably wired the remaining funds to their escrow account. I knew it was Samuel. I had confronted him about it once, sitting on his back porch while he drank a beer, his scarred hand wrapped awkwardly around the glass. I had told him he was giving away everything he had worked for. Samuel had just shaken his head, looking out at his garden. "A man does not need credit for holding up his family, Robert," Samuel had told me, his voice rough and quiet. "He just needs them standing. I don't need Natalie to say thank you. I just need her to have a good life." He had given everything to make sure my daughter stood tall. And this morning, that same daughter had told me his funeral was a waste of time. She had looked at my grief and seen nothing but an obstacle to her mimosa brunch. I looked at Leo and Maya. They were laughing at the cartoon on the television, completely oblivious to the heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the room. I loved them, fiercely. They were my blood. But as I watched them, a terrible realization settled over me. By constantly enabling Natalie, by letting her treat me like a disposable utility, I wasn't just disrespecting myself. I was disrespecting the life that Samuel had sacrificed his own dreams to save. I was allowing my daughter to take the very existence Samuel had fought for and reduce it to a free babysitting service. Samuel had not kicked down a burning door, so I could be treated like an indentured servant by a daughter who couldn't even pretend to care that he was dead. I stood up from the kitchen island. The sadness that had been drowning me all morning suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, hard, unyielding clarity. The retired, agreeable grandfather who always said yes was gone. The man standing in the kitchen was the man who had survived a fire. I walked over to the kitchen table. I picked up the stock with Natalie's meticulously color-coded schedule. I didn't rip it. I didn't fold it. I just dropped it directly into the kitchen trash can. right on top of yesterday's coffee grounds. I walked into the living room and picked up the television remote. I pressed the power button. The screen went black. The loud cartoon music was instantly cut off. Leo and Maya spun around, their eyes wide with surprise and impending protest. "Grandpa," Leo whined. "We were watching that." "Mommy says we get 30 minutes of screen train time." "Mommy isn't here," I said, my voice calm but carrying an authority I hadn't used in years. "Go to the guest bedroom, both of you. Open the bags your mother brought and find the nicest clothes you have." Maya blinked, clutching her juice box. "Are we going to the park?" "No," I said softly, looking down at my small, beautiful granddaughter. "We are going somewhere much more important." "But Mommy said we have to stay inside today," Leo argued, crossing his arms over his chest. "She said you were supposed to watch us." I walked over to Leo. I knelt down so I was at eye level with him. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "Leo," I said, my voice steady, "your mother gave me a schedule for today, but today is a day about family, and sometimes doing the right thing for your family means ignoring the schedule." I stood back up, straightening my black suit jacket, adjusting the white carnation on my lapel. "Go get dressed," I commanded. "We leave in 10 minutes." The children scurried off down the hallway, sensing the shift in the air. I walked to the front window and looked out at the gray, drizzly morning. The rain was picking up, washing the streets clean. I reached into my pocket and touched the burned pocket watch one last time, drawing strength from the scarred metal. Natalie thought I was choosing a funeral over babysitting. She had no idea I was taking her children to meet the reason she had a father at all. The memorial reception was held in the large, wood-paneled community hall of the church where Samuel had been a quiet but steadfast member for over 30 years. When I arrived with Leo and Maya, the room was already filled with people. There were accountants who had worked with him, neighbors whose lawns he had mowed when they were sick, and a surprising number of retired firefighters in dress uniforms. Men who remembered the 28-year-old kid who had charged into a blazing duplex without a second thought. The air was heavy with grief, but it was also thick with a profound, almost tangible sense of respect. I held a child's hand in each of mine as we walked through the double doors. The children were quiet, sensing the somber mood of the room. Leo was wearing his little navy blazer and khakis. Maya was in a dark blue dress with a white collar. They looked perfect. They looked like family. At the front of the hall, resting on an easel beside a large arrangement of white lilies, was a photograph of Samuel. It was taken a few years ago. He was wearing his favorite worn-out flannel shirt, standing in his garden, smiling that easy, lopsided smile. The collar of the shirt was slightly open, revealing the thick, knotted edge of the burn scar that climbed up his neck. I walked the children over to the photograph. "Who is that, Grandpa?" Maya asked softly, her wide brown eyes looking up at the picture. "That is your Uncle Samuel, Maya," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He was my big brother." "Why does he have a boo-boo on his neck?" Leo asked, pointing at the photograph. He possessed the blunt curiosity that only a 7-year-old could have. Before I could answer, an older man standing nearby turned toward us. He was wearing a dark suit with a small, gold firefighter's axe pinned to the lapel. I recognized him immediately. It was Captain Harris, the man who had pulled up to the burning duplex 40 years ago, just as Samuel was dragging me across the lawn. "That's not a boo-boo, son," Captain Harris said, his voice deep and gravelly. He crouched down so he was eye level with Leo. "That's a medal." Leo frowned in confusion. "Medals are made of gold. The ones they give you in ceremonies are," Harris said, offering a sad smile. "But the ones you earn when nobody is watching, those are made of scars. Your uncle got that scar pulling your grandfather out of a fire a long time ago. If Samuel hadn't kicked that door down, the fire department wouldn't have gotten there in time." Harris stood up and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezing it tightly. "He was a good man, Robert, the bravest civilian I ever met." "Thank you, Captain," I said, my throat incredibly tight. As Harris walked away, Leo looked up at me, his young mind working hard to process the information. He looked from me to the photograph of Samuel and then back to me. "Grandpa," Leo said quietly, "if he saved you from the fire, does that mean he saved Mommy too?" The innocence of the question struck me right in the center of the chest. It was a simple line of logic, but it carried a profound truth. If I had died in that hallway at 28, Natalie would never have been born. Leo and Maya would not exist. Everything my daughter had, her children, her home, her life, her very breath, was built on the foundation of Samuel's ruined arm. I knelt down, pulling both Leo and Maya into a tight embrace. "Yes, sweetheart," I whispered into Leo's hair, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. In more ways than she knows, we spent the next hour walking through the hall. People I hadn't seen in years came up to shake my hand and offer their condolences. Many of them crouched down to speak to the children. Again and again, I heard the same sentiment. "Samuel talked about you all the time. He loved these kids so much. He always showed us their school pictures." Samuel had loved Natalie and her children from a distance, watching them grow through the updates and photographs I sent him, never demanding a seat at their table, content just to know they were eating well. At exactly 12:30, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the community hall were thrown open with a violent, echoing bang. The quiet hum of respectful conversation in the room instantly died. I turned around. Standing in the doorway, breathless, flushed with anger, and glaring fiercely across the room, was Natalie. She was still wearing the expensive silk dress from her brunch. She had a designer trench coat thrown hastily over her shoulders. She looked entirely out of place in a room full of grieving people in dark clothing. She looked like a woman who had just had a very recent weekend violently derailed. Later, I learned the brunch had only been the first stop. Natalie and David were supposed to spend the rest of the weekend at an exclusive lakeside resort with David's potential partners, the kind of place where people discussed promotions over wine lists and pretended family emergencies were simply scheduling errors. They had planned every hour of their luxurious weekend around my silence. I was not a person in their itinerary. I was just the empty square labeled childcare. When Natalie and David returned to my house after the investor brunch, intending to grab the bags they had forgotten before driving to the resort for the rest of their weekend, they found the house locked and empty. It hadn't taken Natalie long to track my location using the family sharing app on her phone. She spotted me standing near the photograph of Samuel, holding Leo and Maya's hands. Natalie didn't pause. She didn't look at the grieving faces turning toward her. She marched straight down the center aisle of the hall, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. "What are you doing?" Natalie hissed as she reached us, keeping her voice low but lacing every word with pure venom. She grabbed Maya's hand and pulled her away from me. "Grab your brother, Maya. We're leaving." Maya whimpered, startled by her mother's aggressive grip. "Mommy, you're hurting me." "Let go of her, Natalie," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Don't you tell me what to do with my children," Natalie snapped, her volume rising slightly, causing the people standing nearby to take a step back in shock. "I left them at your house with a schedule. We had plans, Dad. You don't just kidnap my kids and drag them across town without answering your phone." "They are safe, Natalie," I said, refusing to back down. "And they are dressed appropriately." "I don't care how they are dressed," Natalie retorted, gesturing wildly around the room. David had just walked through the double doors behind her, hovering near the entrance, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "You had no right to bring them here. A funeral is not a place for children. It's morbid. It's depressing. I told you I had a non-refundable brunch, and you completely ignored me." The silence in the community hall was now absolute. Every single person in the room, over 100 friends, neighbors, and colleagues who had loved Samuel, was staring at my daughter. They were listening to a 38-year-old woman throw a temper tantrum about a brunch at the memorial service of a man who had sacrificed everything for her family. I felt a hot, burning flush of profound embarrassment, not for myself, but for her. "Your uncle died, Natalie," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the dead silent room. I wasn't whispering anymore. I wanted her to hear it. I wanted everyone to hear it. "I brought your children to say goodbye to the reason their grandfather survived long enough to love them." Natalie scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. The silk dress rustled loudly. "Stop being so dramatic, Dad," Natalie said, rolling her eyes. "He was an old man who lived 2 hours away. I barely knew him." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. I barely knew him. I saw Captain Harris close his eyes, shaking his head in silent disgust. I saw a group of Samuel's old accounting partners exchange horrified glances. Natalie had just stood in front of Samuel's entire world and declared that his life was completely irrelevant to hers. "You didn't know him," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, gritty whisper. "Because you never bothered to look up from yourself long enough to see who was holding the sky up over your head." Natalie opened her mouth to snap a retort, her face red with indignant fury. Before she could speak, a man stepped out from the small group of people standing near Samuel's photograph. He was a tall, distinguished man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp, conservative gray suit and holding a thick manila folder. I recognized him. It was Arthur Pendleton, Samuel's longtime attorney and close personal friend. Arthur walked slowly toward us. He didn't look angry. He looked cold. It was the clinical, detached coldness of a lawyer who was about to execute a legal document that would destroy someone's reality. "Excuse me," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. He stopped a few feet away from Natalie, adjusting his glasses as he looked her up and down. "You must be Natalie." Natalie blinked, thrown slightly off balance by the interruption. She adjusted her designer coat, trying to regain her air of superiority. "I am," Natalie said defensively. "And who are you?" "My name is Arthur Pendleton," he replied, his tone perfectly even. "I am the executor of Samuel Hale's estate. And since you are already here, making such a spirited defense of your time and your priorities, I believe we can expedite the reading of your uncle's will." Natalie frowned, her anger momentarily derailed by confusion. "A will reading now? I told you, I barely knew the man. I don't care about his will. I'm taking my kids home." Arthur didn't move out of her way. He simply opened the manila folder. "You may not have known him," Natalie, Arthur said softly, his eyes locking onto hers. "But considering he has been quietly paying for the life you are currently living for the last 15 years, I strongly suggest you stay and listen." The color drained instantly from Natalie's face. Natalie's words died in the room before the flowers did. Then Samuel's lawyer stepped forward with a folder she had never bothered to deserve. The absolute silence in the community hall was suddenly deafening. Arthur Pendleton, a man who possessed the terrifying calm of someone holding all the cards in a very high-stakes game, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every single person in the room was hanging on his every word. Natalie stared at him, her manicured hands gripping her designer trench coat. The anger that had propelled her through the double doors just moments ago was rapidly dissolving, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "What are you talking about?" Natalie demanded, her voice losing its sharp edge. She shot a quick, nervous glance back at David, who was suddenly looking very intently at the lawyer. "My uncle didn't pay for my life. My husband and I both have very successful careers. We are entirely self-sufficient." Arthur offered a small, deeply pitying smile. "Self-sufficiency is a wonderful illusion, Natalie," Arthur said smoothly, opening the thick manila folder in his hands. "It is a luxury usually afforded to those who refuse to look down and see the foundation someone else built for them." Fortunately, Samuel Hale kept meticulous records. Arthur pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, slipped them on, and looked down at the first document. 15 years ago, when you were a junior at a private university, your father encountered a significant financial hardship due to medical bills, Arthur began, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the hall. The university informed you that unless the tuition gap was closed, you would not be permitted to enroll for the spring semester. Natalie swallowed hard. I got a private merit scholarship. The dean's office called me. You received a direct, anonymous disbursement of $45,000 from the Hale Family Education Trust, Arthur corrected her, holding up a bank ledger. A trust established entirely by Samuel Hale, using his own liquidated retirement assets. There was no scholarship committee, Natalie. There was only your uncle, walking into my office and signing away his own financial security so you wouldn't have to drop out of school. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Natalie opened her mouth, then closed it again. As if the word scholarship had suddenly turned poisonous, her face went completely pale. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. Dad, is that true? Yes, I said quietly, the burned pocket watch feeling heavy in my pocket. He made me swear never to tell you. He didn't want you to feel like you owed him. Arthur didn't give her time to process it. He turned to the next page in the folder. 12 years ago, before you were married to David, you required an emergency appendectomy, Arthur continued mercilessly. You were between jobs. You had no health insurance. The hospital billed you $32,000. The hospital forgave the debt, Natalie stammered, taking a step back, her silk dress rustling. They sent a letter saying it was a clerical adjustment for low-income patients. Hospitals do not forgive $32,000 debts out of the goodness of their hearts, Arthur said, his tone dry and factual. Samuel Hale paid the balance in full through a cashier's check, routed through my firm to protect his anonymity. Natalie took a shaky breath, grabbing the edge of a nearby pew to steady herself. The reality was beginning to set in, dismantling the comfortable lie she had lived in for over a decade. David stepped out from behind his wife. The arrogant, corporate swagger he had carried into my kitchen that morning was completely gone. He was staring at Arthur with wide, panicked eyes. Wait, David said, his voice cracking slightly. 5 years ago, when Natalie and I bought our house in the suburbs, our mortgage broker said a silent family trust had cleared our down payment. We thought. David looked at me, suddenly realizing how absurd his assumption had been. We thought Robert had taken out a second mortgage to help us. Your father was already drowning in his late wife's medical debt, David, Arthur said sharply. He had nothing left to give you. That wire transfer of $85,000 came directly from Samuel Hale. He bought the roof over your head. David actually took one step backward, the way people do when a bill they never paid finally finds them. The arrogant corporate consultant had just been reduced to a man standing in a church, realizing he was a charity case. Arthur paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. $45,000 for tuition, $32,000 for medical bills, $85,000 for a house. The people in the community hall were staring at Natalie, their faces a mixture of shock and quiet disgust. For years, Natalie had paraded her self-made lifestyle, wearing expensive silk dresses and attending non-refundable investor brunches, entirely oblivious to the fact that her luxury was built on the scarred back of a man she had just dismissed as an irrelevant old man. Natalie looked like the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath her. I didn't know, Natalie whispered, her hands shaking as she pulled her coat tighter around herself. She looked at Samuel's photograph, her eyes welling with tears of profound embarrassment. I had no idea. And yet, Arthur said softly, closing the ledger, when you were informed of his death, your first instinct was to complain that his funeral was going to interfere with your brunch. Arthur reached into the back of the folder and pulled out a single sealed envelope. Samuel did not want you to know about the money, Arthur explained, looking directly at Natalie. He believed that a man does not need credit for holding up his family. He just needs them standing. However, when his health began to fail last year, we updated the terms of the Hale Family Education Trust. And he asked me to read this letter to you upon his passing. Arthur broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded a piece of heavy cream paper. The room was so quiet I could hear the rain tapping against the stained glass windows of the church hall. "Natalie," Arthur read, his voice carrying the deep, quiet dignity of my brother's words. "If you are hearing this, I hope you came to say goodbye because you remembered family, not because someone told you money was being discussed." Natalie flinched as if she had been physically struck. A few of the retired firefighters in the back row lowered their heads. It was a brutal, heartbreaking opening line, because Samuel had known exactly who she was, and she had just proven him right in the most public way possible. "I never wanted you to know about the financial help," the letter continued. "I wanted you to believe that the world was fair, and that your hard work was the only thing carrying you forward. But the world is not fair, Natalie. Sometimes it catches fire, and when it does, the only thing that matters is who is willing to walk into the flames for you." Arthur paused, clearing his throat slightly. "Your father walked into the flames for you every single day." Arthur read, "He sacrificed his own peace to raise you. And I have spent the last 3 years watching you treat his devotion like a cheap commodity. You have treated his time as if it belongs to you, and his grief as if it is an inconvenience." I closed my eyes. Samuel had seen it. Even from 2 hours away, even without me complaining to him, my brother had seen exactly what was happening to me. "The remaining balance of the Hale Family Education Trust is substantial," Arthur read, his voice hardening slightly. "It is designed to ensure that Leo and Maya will never have to worry about college tuition, medical emergencies, or the down payment on their first homes. I love them, just as I love you." Arthur folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. "The trust is fully funded," Arthur announced to the room, putting his glasses back in his pocket. "It currently holds just over $1.2 million in diversified assets. You did not inherit Samuel's generosity, Natalie. You spent it without knowing his name was on the receipt." David let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. $1.2 million. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to secure their children's futures entirely. "However," Arthur said, holding up a legal document, his eyes locking onto Natalie and David, "Samuel named only one trustee to manage and distribute those funds, Robert Hale." Natalie looked at me, her mouth slightly open. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, his voice ringing with absolute legal finality, "the trust contains a strict, non-negotiable stipulation. As the sole trustee, Robert has absolute discretion over all disbursements. But if any beneficiary of this trust, including the parents of the minor beneficiaries, exploits, abuses, or forces Robert to sacrifice his own well-being, dignity, or time, Robert is legally mandated to suspend all financial support immediately." Arthur stepped closer to Natalie. "Let me be perfectly clear, Natalie," Arthur said coldly. "If you ever treat your father like a free babysitting service again, if you ever speak to him with the gross disrespect you displayed in this room today, he has the legal authority and the explicit instruction to cut your family off entirely." Natalie stood frozen in the center of the community hall. The silk dress, the designer coat, the expensive blowout, none of it could hide the absolute, crushing reality of what had just happened. She had stormed into a funeral to publicly humiliate her father for missing a babysitting shift. Instead, she had just been publicly dismantled by a dead man who had funded her entire existence. She turned slowly to look at me. For the first time in years, the cold entitlement in her eyes was gone. It was replaced by a deep, terrifying realization that she had pushed me too far, and that the safety net she had taken for granted her entire life was being held by the very man she had been actively exploiting. "Dad," Natalie whispered, her voice trembling, tears spilling down her cheeks. Dad, I looked at my daughter. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive triumph. I just felt a profound, heavy sadness for the woman she had become. You did not ask me to babysit, Natalie, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. You ordered me to miss the funeral of the man who made sure I lived long enough to become your father. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burned silver pocket watch. I held it up so she could see the warped, blackened metal on the back casing. My brother once carried me out of a fire, I said, my voice breaking on the last word. You could not carry one Sunday for me. Natalie covered her mouth with her hand, a quiet sob tearing from her throat. She looked at the burned watch, then at Samuel's photograph, and finally at the hundreds of people in the room who were watching her with silent judgment. David didn't try to defend her. He couldn't. He just looked at the floor, his face burning with shame. Natalie had come to the memorial angry that I had ruined her Sunday. She left understanding Samuel had been quietly paying for the Sundays she thought belonged to her. The days following the memorial service were quiet. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of grief, but rather the stark, ringing quiet that follows the detonation of a bomb. Natalie didn't call on Monday. She didn't call on Tuesday. On Wednesday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the front door to find Natalie standing on the porch. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't have Leo holding her right hand and Maya clinging to her left leg. She didn't have a canvas tote bag full of organic snacks, and she wasn't holding a color-coded schedule. She was just standing there, looking smaller and older than her 38 years. She was wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. "Hi, Dad," Natalie said softly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of a passing car. "Hello, Natalie," I replied, stepping back to let her in. She walked into the living room and sat down on the edge of the sofa, looking incredibly uncomfortable in the house she had treated as her personal drop-off center for years. I sat down in my armchair across from her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," Natalie finally whispered, looking down at her hands. The tears came quickly, hot and genuine. "Dad, I am so sorry. For Sunday. For what I said. For everything." I didn't interrupt her. I let her speak. "I didn't know," Natalie continued, her voice trembling as she looked up at me. "I swear to you, Dad, I didn't know Uncle Samuel did all that. If I had known he paid for my college, if I had known he bought our house, I never would have said those things. I never would have acted that way at the funeral. I just didn't know." She was looking at me desperately, waiting for absolution. She was waiting for me to nod, to accept her apology, to tell her that it was a simple misunderstanding and that everything could go back to normal now that she knew the truth about the money. I looked at my daughter, feeling a deep, profound ache in my chest. "That is not why you should have cared, Natalie," I said quietly. Natalie blinked, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "What?" "The money," I explained, my voice steady and completely devoid of anger. "You are apologizing because you found out the man you insulted was writing the checks that funded your life. You are apologizing because you realize the old man you dismissed was secretly your benefactor. But that is not why you should have cared." I leaned forward in my armchair, resting my elbows on my knees. "You are not sorry because you hurt me," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, steady register. "You are sorry because you finally saw the price tag on the man you dismissed." Natalie flinched as if she had been slapped. "You should have cared because he was my brother," I continued. "You should have cared because I loved him. You should have cared because your father was grieving, and instead of asking if I was okay, you demanded to know who was going to watch your children while you drank mimosas." Natalie flinched, looking away, her face burning with shame. "If Samuel had died penniless," I continued, "if he had never given you a single dime, it still would not have given you the right to treat my grief like a scheduling problem." "I know," Natalie sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I know, Dad. I was awful. I've been so awful. Yes, I agreed softly. You have been. It was the hardest thing I had ever said to my daughter, but it was the truest. I love Leo and Maya, I told her, letting the silence settle before I spoke again. They are my blood, and they are the light of my life. I will always be their grandfather, and as the trustee of the Hale Family Education Trust, I will ensure that every single penny Samuel left for them is used exactly as he intended. Their college is paid for. Their future is secure. Samuel made sure of that, and I will protect it. Natalie lowered her hands, looking at me with a desperate, fragile hope. But I am no longer your employee, Natalie, I said, my voice hardening into an unbreakable boundary. My retirement is not your childcare budget. I am no longer your free, default, mandatory babysitting service. Dad, I won't ever just drop them off again. I promise, Natalie pleaded. I know you won't, I replied calmly. Because for the next 90 days I will not babysit. Not because I do not love Leo and Maya, but because you need to learn what my time actually costs when it is no longer free. You and David will arrange childcare like adults. You will adjust your brunches, your client dinners, and your weekends without assuming I am the emergency exit. Natalie nodded quickly, crying harder now, not because she was being punished, but because she finally understood that the door she had slammed so carelessly for years had a lock on it. And after those 90 days, I said, you will ask. You will not inform. You will call me. You will ask if I am available, and if I say no for any reason, or for no reason at all, you will accept it. You will not guilt-trip me. You will not tell me that I have nothing else to do. You will respect my time, and you will respect my life. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. If you cannot do that, I said, looking down at her, then I will exercise the legal authority Arthur Pendleton outlined at the memorial, and I will freeze every single asset connected to your household. Natalie nodded quickly, standing up from the sofa. I understand, Dad. I do. I promise. And Natalie, I added before she reached the door, this is not about punishing you for one bad Sunday. This is about teaching you that love without respect becomes entitlement. I will not teach Leo and Maya that grandparents are people you use until they break. She stopped, turning back to look at me one last time. There was no entitlement left in her eyes. There was only the humbling realization that she had almost lost the only two men who had ever truly caught her when she fell. I love you, Dad, she whispered. I love you too, Natalie, I said. Now go home. 3 weeks later, Sunday morning arrived with a brilliant, clear blue sky. The air was crisp and cold, hinting at the approaching winter. I was not standing in my kitchen wiping down counters. I was not reading a color-coded schedule, and I was not waiting for a silver SUV to abruptly pull into my driveway. I was standing on a quiet, rolling green hill at the Oak Ridge Cemetery. I wasn't alone. Leo was standing on my right, holding a small bouquet of yellow daisies. Maya was standing on my left, her tiny, mittened hand gripping mine tightly. Natalie had dropped them off an hour ago. After explicitly calling on Thursday evening to ask if I would like to take the kids for the morning, we stood in front of a simple, elegant granite headstone. Samuel Hale, brother, protector. A life well lived in the service of others. Go ahead, Leo, I said softly. Leo stepped forward and carefully placed the yellow daisies at the base of the headstone. He stepped back, looking up at the engraved letters. Grandpa? Leo asked, his voice breaking the quiet stillness of the cemetery. Yes, buddy. Was Uncle Samuel a hero? Leo asked, looking up at me with his large, serious eyes. I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers wrapped around the heavy silver pocket watch. I pulled it out, holding the warped, burned metal in the palm of my hand. The glass face was cracked, and the hands were still running 3 minutes slow. I looked at my grandson, and then I looked at the grave of the man who had kicked down a burning door 40 years ago. Yes, Leo, I said softly, a warm, peaceful smile spreading across my face. He was. Because he saved you from the fire, Maya chimed in, pointing a mittened finger at the pocket watch. Yes, I agreed, kneeling down in the grass so I was at eye level with both of them. But not just because he saved me once, because he kept saving people every single day of his life, and he never once asked them to notice. Did Mommy know? Leo asked. I looked toward the road where Natalie's car had disappeared earlier that morning. Not enough, I said softly, but she is learning. Maya reached out and placed her small mitten on the cold granite stone. Thank you for saving Grandpa, she whispered. The wind moved across the hill, soft and clean, and for the first time since Samuel died, I felt something in my chest loosen. I closed my hand around the watch and stood back up, letting the cold autumn breeze wash over us. My daughter thought Sunday was about babysitting. She was wrong. Sunday was the day my grandchildren learned what family means, and the day my daughter learned she had been spending love she never bothered to respect. Asterisk, if you were Robert, would you keep helping Natalie because she is your daughter? Or did forcing him to miss his brother's funeral prove she needed to lose the comfort she had mistaken for obligation? Let me know in the comments.